And our Torah portion tonight is Vayishlakh, which it means and sent. And the problem I had with the Torah portion, preparing for it yesterday and today, is I started off in one direction, and then this morning I slammed on the brakes and I went in a different direction. Not a completely different direction, but in a different direction, because I found a text that I had never found before. I mean, I have the book, I have a copy of the Hebrew Matthew, the Shem Tov version of the Hebrew Matthew, but I had never noticed in the Beatitudes something that I found today. And it explains, I think it helps to explain, it doesn't completely explain, but I think it helps to explain some of the misunderstanding about what Yeshua came to do, and how for a lot of people, they have the perception that he came to change the law, that he arrived on the scene with something new and fresh and better than what was in the Old Testament. And in the Beatitudes, we hear this very rhythmic, poetic, what seems like contrasting statements is the word I'm looking for, where he says, well, you have heard it said, but I say unto you, and then he follows with what often is taught as a new law, a better way than what was said unto them from ancient times. And I think sometimes our problem comes in the translation. And that's what I figured out today when I went back. We know that the Gospel of Matthew was most likely originally written in Hebrew. There's some doubt about the other Gospels. Some people have whole ministries based on proving that the entire New Testament was originally written in Hebrew. That's not my position. I'm not against it. I'm not for it. I just haven't seen enough evidence to believe it. But we do have enough information recorded by the church fathers that tells us they all knew that there was an original Hebrew Gospel of Matthew in circulation, and they even quote from it. So if the church fathers who are hostile to Jewish believers are copying from the Hebrew text, that in itself lends validity. If the people who oppose you are quoting you, then it must be right on. That's not typically how it goes. So it was in working through a text on vows, because the problem we want to look at in the text from Vayishlakh today is, why did Jacob have so much trouble? Because we mentioned that last week, even at toward the end of Jacob's life, when he goes to meet Pharaoh, he essentially says, I've had a few days and they were full of trouble. And you don't really hear that message from Abraham and Isaac, but from Jacob, as he looks into his past, he says, you know what, my time on this earth was difficult. And so maybe it's no coincidence that when we look at the birth pangs of the Messiah and the day of the Lord and the end times, or whatever phrases we want to use for that we also have on that bookcase Jacob's trouble. And, we all want to understand Jacob's trouble. Well, understanding Jacob's trouble is probably no more difficult than studying this Torah portion in minute detail. Because if there will be a Jacob's trouble in the future, I guarantee you, again, it's not going to be a brand new thing. It will be a trouble that we are expected to already anticipate and know about, and therefore be equipped to handle it, because that's what the scriptures are for. They're for equipping us for the future. They're not just stories. We're not just reading, great bedtime stories for kids right now. It might seem like it when we're in Genesis, but that's not true. They just happen to be great kids stories because we are kids, and that's how we learn, through story. And so he starts telling us the story first before he introduces us to sometimes law that is very difficult to understand or even impossible on this side of the garden to understand. And so he takes the easiest approach possible with us. He takes the approach of story to engage us, to draw us into the narrative so that we will have our heroes. And we don't realize as we're enjoying the stories that we're reading face-to-face prophecy. I mean, this is hardcore prophecy. Isaiah, prophecy. Jeremiah, prophecy. Genesis, face-to-face prophecy. It's not through visions and dreams and dark sayings. It's mouth to mouth with Moses. And so we're not going to do an apocalyptic study tonight, but every bit of what we might think is minutia in the Torah portion is not minute at all. Once we acquire some of these details, we can begin building our strategies and our tactics for Jacob's trouble. Because if he went through certain kinds of troubles, then I think we can anticipate going through the same thing. So let me share the screen with you. And like I said, because I changed direction so fast this morning, I don't know if this is going to make, the PowerPoints are going to make any sense at all, but we'll see what happens. And the picture I've got up there for you, the story in this Torah portion is going to begin with Jacob and his family crossing it'll read in English, the Jabbok River, which always makes me think of Alice in Wonderland and Jabberwocky, but it would be Yavuk in Hebrew, Yavuk. And it's just on the others to the east of the Jordan. And so they haven't made it too far into what we would later call the land of Israel yet, because right now the Yavuk is running through Jordan. It's on the Jordan side of the boundary line. But you can see by the size here of the Yavuk that it's not anything huge. It's not a stream or a river that you would drown in. But nevertheless, all these sources of water like this in Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, they're going to be very important, especially if you have livestock. And so Jacob's going to be sticking with a route where he can water his flocks. And so for those listening on audio, the readings are Genesis 32:4 through 36:43, Hosea 11:7 through 12:12, and Obadiah 1:1 through 21, Psalm 3, and then I picked out Acts 20, verse 16, because I want you to have that key piece of information in verse 16, and then flip forward to chapter 21, verses 15 through 26. And what that does, it gives you the starting point, why Paul wanted to be in Jerusalem. He wanted to be there for a specific feast, and that's what verse 16 will tell you. And then later, the story starts telling you about the events that happened once he arrived. But I wanted you to have the context of those Nazirite vows that he paid for, that they were being paid at the Feast of Pentecost or Shavuot. And so we needed that context for what we're going to talk about tonight. Here's your memory book. There's Vayishlakh. I made this one a little longer, so you might want to condense for Vayishlakh. But I did want to take in not just the wrestling match with the man, his fear of Esau, but I wanted to somehow remember that this Torah portion of all portions really is Jacob's trouble. And so what I wrote was Jacob wrestled in his return to Canaan, and in fear of Esau, he, Vayishlakh, sent messengers with gifts to Esau. And the meeting went well, yet his family experienced many troubles. So yeah, that's a little longer than we usually do. And it's a shorter portion, but again, vital to understanding Jacob's trouble. And so the question I started off with, the one that I wanted to pursue is it okay to be afraid of Jacob's trouble? Because the longer we get into this COVID thing, the more we realize even believers are afraid. They're afraid of a lot of things because life is just gradually being flipped upside down. And we knew that was going to happen. We've been talking about that since the 10th of Tevet, since we realized that was the date that the plague was formally announced, on the 10th of Tevet, on the fast of Tevet. And then the Gregorian year 2020 is kind of strange because we're going to have two 10th of Tevets in one Gregorian year. Because see, it fell in January last year. I mean, this year. I keep on to say last year, but it was still this year. And so the next 10th of Tevet falls on December the 25th. I don't know if that's coincidence or not, but two 10th of Tevets within one Gregorian year, it has my attention because it's a double. And tonight we're going to talk about the double principle. When you see a double of something, you're supposed to pay attention because it carries with it an element of legality. It's almost as though, well, it's not almost, it is. It's in the context of court proceedings when you see a doubled word like that. And I'll show you why here in a minute. But the question was, is it okay to be afraid of Jacob's trouble? Because lots of people are. And we certainly don't blame unbelievers for being afraid. And then what follows fear is anger. We don't blame them because they don't have the same hope that we do. But then we see even believers being, maybe not terrified, but definitely deeply concerned about what the future holds. And so I thought tonight we might keep that in mind as we're looking at Jacob's trouble. How should we feel about this trouble that the house of Jacob is in right now? Because it's affected the entire world. It's not just affected, one family in the land of Israel. This is something that's affecting the entire world. And if, according to last week's prophecy, Jacob's job is to bring home the flocks from the exile, if we are those flocks moving home, is it normal for us to feel afraid? And so let's look again. Let's go back to the Midrash like we did last week. And I don't want to read this whole thing to you, but I did want to cite for you, at least on the PowerPoint, the entire passage. So if you wanted to go back later and read it word for word, or if you even wanted to go to the Midrash and read more context, you could. But in a nutshell, the rabbis are commenting on this statement from Genesis 32:8, where it says, Jacob became very frightened and distressed. And he's not a man that we would expect at this point in his journey would become very frightened and distressed. I mean, look at all the miraculous things that have happened to him up to this point. And in a sense, we can say the exact same thing. Look at all the miraculous things that have happened to us up to this point to bring us to this season of our relationship with the Father. And nevertheless, it's still possible that when we see trouble approaching, or when we know we're approaching trouble on purpose, because the Father told us to, we see Jacob becomes very frightened and distressed. So if he became frightened and distressed, I shouldn't think it's unusual when believers become frightened and distressed. Now, we don't want them to stay in that condition, right? But it's a normal human emotion. If you know you're walking into a life-threatening situation, whether it's something fast, like Esau approaching with 400 armed men, or if it's something slow, which is a plague, which is a downturn in the economy, those sorts of things, then I can say, yeah, it's probably okay to be frightened and distressed. It's how you handle this fear and distress. And it's who you turn to in this fear and distress, so that, like is written in, I believe it's in the Psalm for this week, Psalm 3, where it talks about the distress and so forth, but it says, nevertheless, I'm not going to be afraid. In other words, I'm not going to remain in a perpetual state of fear. It's fine to feel those emotions of fear, but then we are given a way of working through them. And so what the rabbis are pointing out in this midrash is that people who were specifically chosen, it speaks of Jacob, one of the patriarchs. It says in Psalm 135:4, for Jacob, Yah chose for him. And then he says to him in Genesis 28:15, before this fear comes over Jacob, he's told 4 chapters earlier, behold, I am with you. And nevertheless, after having been assured that the Holy One is with him, at the end, he becomes frightened. And that's what it says. Jacob became very frightened. And Moses was another one who was called chosen. Psalms 106:23 calls Moses chosen, the chosen one. And he was told by Adonai, I will be with you. But in the end, when we make it to Numbers 21:34, we see he became frightened, because it says, Hashem said to Moshe, don't fear him, don't fear Pharaoh. And they make the point, he wouldn't have to tell Moshe, don't fear him, if Moshe wasn't fearing him. He's become afraid at that point. In spite of the miracles in his hand, he still becomes frightened and distressed. And so he has to be reassured. And so if these chosen people like Jacob, who were literally promised security and told that he would be with them, and these people became frightened, then how much more likely is it that we would become frightened? And Isaiah 51:13, they point out, says, you forgot Hashem, your maker, the one who spread the heavens and founded earth. He said to those people what he would say to you. And they quote Jeremiah 31:36. So said Hashem, if the heavens from above will be measured, if you will see that the heavens quake and that the earth quakes from the inclination of the heavens and earth, you wouldn't learn anything other than Isaiah 51:13, and you were afraid all your days. So we're always susceptible, in spite of the great miracles that have brought us to this season. When we see genuine trouble ahead, we are susceptible to being frightened, or at least extremely concerned about what might happen next. And so this brings us to the question. We know we have the wrestling match. There's different ideas about who the man was that Jacob wrestled with all night. And we'll look more at why Jacob went back and spent the night alone, why he pushed his family forward to protect them, but then backtracks and leaves them unprotected, at least from him. And so we see that Jacob is at least taking care to arrange the camp for maximum protection from Esau. And he does. He even goes back to make sure that no object was left behind on the other side of the Yavok stream. So having taken such care at this point, when we know he's frightened and distressed, recognizing the danger of Esau coming with 400 men, and not knowing the condition of Esau's emotions at that point, why then does he turn right around and not recognize the danger to his daughter Dinah in Shechem? Why does he stop and buy a field there and know that he is surrounded by danger, and yet allow his daughter to go out and to mingle with the Shechemites to the point that she could be raped and kidnapped? And so the sages point us back in this incident to the meeting with Esau. They see these as two events that have a connection. In fact, the Midrash says that Jacob hid Dinah, because if you read the text, Dinah's not in there. You see the sons coming with their mothers, but you don't see Dinah. And that's the problem that's bothering Rashi in this week's Torah portion, is where's Dinah? And they believe that Dinah was hidden, so that Esau, who was known to be a lustful adulterer, a man who would take things by force if he wanted them, they believe that Jacob hid her from Esau because he knew his character, because he didn't want Esau to take her in marriage. They believed that Leah and Rachel were twins, and that the original plan between the two families was that Esau would marry Leah and then Jacob would marry Rachel. Instead, Jacob marries them. But they believe the original plan was the twins marry twins. And at any rate, whether that's true or not, we know that Dinah's missing. They think Jacob believes that, having seen Dinah, who was apparently very beautiful, that he would take her in marriage. And because he tended toward evil, that she was a virtuous woman and it would be a good thing. So they hide her. But then turn right around, next in the text, we start reading about Dinah being violated by Shechem. And so the question comes up, how could he have been so protective of her from Esau, but then just let her venture out on her own at Shechem? And we're often asking this question. This is a question we ask over and over, because we live in a fallen world. Why did this happen? Why do bad things happen to good people? And we ask that question when we don't want to take blame sometimes, not necessarily for our personal contribution. We may have had nothing to do with that particular problem. But what we fail to do is to word the question properly. Because when a daughter is born into a family, it's the job of her family to be part of her protection. It's the job of her husband to protect her. It's the job of her father to protect her. It's the job of her brothers to protect her. And there's real irony that Absalom was more protective of his sister than his father was. That's a real, complex mind bender in scripture. Why did David let that go unpunished? Why did he seem to be, and he may not have been, but the text leaves us wondering, well, where was David and why doesn't he care? Why did she have to go through this and find refuge with her brother, which only builds more resentment in Absalom, when maybe everything could have been turned around if David had become involved in the problem? And so in this, we see Jacob seems to be doing something very similar. He doesn't really become involved in the problem. He leaves the question open-ended as to what to do about the situation. And of course, we know Shimon and Levi don't leave it open-ended. They come up with a plan and demand that the whole city be circumcised. And on the third day, there's our number 3 coming up again, they go in and they just slaughter the Shechemite men. And the rationale there is, it wasn't murder, because going back to the time of Noah, when the earth is drying up, the earth is going to repopulate. We know that according to the 7 Noahide laws, that all mankind is responsible for setting up court systems, for having a system of justice in the earth. And so even by the court systems or the justice systems of that day, the Shechemite, the complete town, had failed. Because there's been a rape and there has been a kidnapping. Dinah's still in possession of Shechem. So he's not allowing Jacob and the brothers to negotiate. Really, he's pretty much saying, I have her. That's not being repentance. That's not full repentance. If there was full repentance, then he would have released her back to her family while any negotiations were done. And so because the court system of Shechem failed to rise to this problem, and because the people of the city then became complicit by not objecting to it, then it's understood that there's really an element of justice here, that we see it as going way overboard. But where there's complicity by not objecting to wrong things that we know are wrong, there may be complicity there. Who knows? All we know is that Jacob just seems not to be paying attention until he realizes what Shimon and Levi has done. And now he realizes that the Canaanites around him would love to take him out at this point. Up to now, it's been pretty much live and let live. At this point, especially the Amorites are believed to have risen up against them. They were just so afraid because of the strength of 2 of Jacob's kids. They thought, well, what if the whole herd got after us? But Jacob recognizes the threat at that point. And so sometimes we create our troubles not by the things we do, but simply by not paying attention as, things degenerate around us. What can we say about Jacob's trouble to come, or if we're in a Jacob's trouble? We can probably say that we will experience troubles that came about and we thought we were doing a good job paying attention to this major thing coming after us like a freight train, and we were paying so much attention to that we completely missed something that was in our own house. In Jacob's case, his daughter, his precious daughter. And so, we'll feel like we really handled this great test, and then we'll turn the other direction and realize that we just completely failed this test. And it's not a great ego booster for sure, but it is human. And Jacob is showing us what it is like to be human. And maybe this is why we do fear and experience distress when we know trouble is coming. We know we're fallible as human beings. We know we are prone to have these great triumphs of the Spirit. And then just like Peter, in a moment, Yeshua turned and said, "Get behind me, Satan, you adversary." Because he had just said, "Blessed are you, Shimon Bar Yonah," and then "Get behind me, Satan." That's how fast it turns. And so I think this is what makes us fear. And we should fear to an extent, because it does make us more vigilant. We should be concerned about things. It makes us more vigilant. What we shouldn't fear is that the Father can't help us through Jacob's troubles. We shouldn't fear that the Father can't help us through our troubles. Yes, we know the troubles are coming. And there may be times when we just feel like it's going to be too much this time. Regardless, the Father is going to be able to help us through it. And so that's a good reason not to have the negative aspect of fear, which is terror. But remember, the same Hebrew word, yirat, it's the definition is respect. It's not terror, it's respect. Same Hebrew word. And so we need to respect the troubles and the tests. We don't need to pat ourselves too hard on the back about some wonderful thing we did under the power of the Holy Spirit, when it could be some things happening right under our noses. While we were so busy patting ourselves on the back on how well things went with Esav, or how I did this wonderful thing in ministry, or how I witnessed to this person and led them to Yeshua, and we're so busy riding that high that we might be inattentive to something else going on. And so you have to wonder if Jacob really hid her to keep Esav, who was circumcised. How did he feel when Dinah was raped by an uncircumcised man? And so where's the balance here? Did Dinah deserve to be erased from the meeting? Well, that goes on in other religions today. It goes on in even the ultra-Orthodox branches of Judaism. They will not allow a woman's face to be seen in their newspapers. They will deface a woman's face from a billboard. They completely erase and efface women from their little enclaves and conclaves. It's the same thing we know in Islam. You erase the face of the female, and you assume that the male is going to exhibit the absolute worst behavior possible. So all that does is perpetuate the expectation that men should be behaving in the worst way possible when they should not. They should be acting according to law and good conduct and good character. And so sometimes we fear the wrong things. She shouldn't have been erased from the meeting with her uncle. But she should not have been left alone with idolatrous strangers. It's finding the balance. And not having that balance brought on one of Jacob's grievous troubles. And then that led to the other trouble with Shimon and Levi. And this is why it does make us fear or be in distress sometimes when we don't know the will of the Father. That is the thing that comes up over and over. What's the most common question I get? How do I know God's will in this situation? We don't. Now, he will answer us. When he will answer us is always the question. How he will answer us is always the question. But while we're seeking those answers, or while we're seeking that path that he wants us to walk, what we have to be conscious of is there is a very fine line between trusting Adonai and tempting him. Putting ourselves or our loved ones in jeopardy because we just think the Father's going to look out for us. And today it's very difficult with parents who have come into a closer walk with Yeshua and a closer walk in the Word when they already have children who are maybe in their teens. And now all of a sudden you have a realization of the dangers of unsupervised dating. Maybe something we did when we were growing up. We were allowed to go on unsupervised dates. But now we realize the danger inherent in this, especially if we don't know the character of the young man or the young woman they want to be alone with before they are mature enough to be alone. Their bodies might be mature enough, but emotionally and spiritually, they are not ready for that temptation, nor are they ready for that danger. And so negotiating through that minefield is very difficult. And if you say, yeah, that's been one of Jacob's troubles I've experienced. How do I manage my daughter? How do I manage my son? How do I protect them in this culture in which I live, which I'm surrounded, and my child is surrounded with sexual messages, with violence, with loose morals. And we know what that leads to. It leads to problems later on. How can I protect my child? And there's no answer to that. It's something that you're just going to have to navigate step by step. But one thing we can learn from Jacob's trouble is that you must be vigilant. You can't not pay attention to what's going on with your kids. Neither can you not pay attention if Esau's coming after you with 400 armed men. If you see trouble coming, you have to prepare for that. But it's the trouble you don't see coming that takes us by surprise sometimes. And so there's a couple of things in the narrative that the sages say explain why Jacob just almost instantly begins experiencing trouble once he crosses into the land. And in order to see that, we have to remember the last thing Jacob said before he left the land. Because remember, he comes back in and he names the place Machanaim. Machanaim. Machane is a camp. And he says, this is the camp of God. Machanaim, though, means two camps. And they explain this by saying there were 600,000 angels who cared for Jacob when he was in exile. And then when he crosses back into the land itself, he'll leave those angels at the boundary. And then, I don't know why they say 600,000, but the other camp that is assigned to him will pick him up once he crosses the boundary. And so there's two camps. There's the camp of angels that takes care of you when you're in exile. And then there's a camp of angels that take care of you when you're brought back into the land. And that has a great implication in terms of if we see the land as symbolic of the Garden of Eden, crossing back into the garden, that he has a camp assigned to care for us in exile, and he has a camp assigned to us to greet us and to care for us when we cross back over, the two camps. But the last thing Jacob says before he leaves is that, if Adonai will give me food to eat, garments to wear, keep me whole in my exile, then when I come back to here, I will sacrifice to him and I will bring him a tenth of everything. And so that constitutes a vow. It's a promise. If you will do this, then I will do this. It's two parties. Rather than just say, Father, I do hope you take care of me when I go to my relative's house. There would have been no vow there. But when he says, if you, then I will, now we have two parties entering into an agreement. And, he even makes these, setting up a pillar, anointing the stone. He's going through various rituals to tell us he takes this very seriously. And basically, he is swearing on the altar. I don't know if you realize that. That's what got my attention today. When Jacob does that, remember, he's sleeping on the Even Shtiyah. He's sleeping on the foundation stone of the temple. And so mystically, he's in Jerusalem in the temple, and he is swearing where his head was on the rock, because we're going to look at this text in Matthew. He's swearing basically by the temple and by the city, and even by his own head where he slept that night. He's swearing by heaven. This is the gates of heaven. He says it. And so we recognize that when he doesn't quickly come and bring the tenth of his flocks and sacrifice and pay the tenth, he has now entered into a danger zone. And that's what it says in Matthew 5:37. It says, but let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond these is of evil. And the English translations of that are usually, let your yes be yes, and let your no be no. That's not exactly right if we look at the Hebrew text. And the Hebrew text makes more legal sense. So let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond these is of evil. In other words, don't add more than you have to. Jacob added way more than he had to. And what do we know? It's better not to vow than to vow and not to pay. But Yeshua even says, if you go beyond this, and we're going to explain what he means by this too. We're going to break it down. He says it's evil. He calls it evil. James, his brother, in James 5:12 says, but above all, now that's serious, above all, my brethren, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath. But your yes is to be yes, and your no, no, so that you may not fall under judgment. Now, I don't have a Hebrew text. I could have looked it up in the Peshitta. My Aramaic's not good, but I could have probably found one with Hebrew letters to verify that translation. But I suspect it's just like Yeshua's, where he's saying, yes, yes, or no, no. Don't go beyond that, so that you may not fall under judgment. So there's two dangers here. Yeshua says outright evil. You could fall into evil. And James says judgment. You could fall into judgment. Now that's pretty serious. And this is what the sages are reading into the situation, why Jacob just seems to start tumbling. What did he have? Like 3 troubles right off the bat, big ones, big, huge troubles. And it's like, finally, it dawns on him, I need to go do what I said I would do. Maybe he asks himself, why is this happening to me? Wait a minute, I just did the right thing. I came home. I came back to the land of my father, and all of a sudden, I've had nothing but trouble. I just thought I had trouble with Lavan, and now I've really got trouble. And they say, what he did is he brought himself under judgment when he delayed to pay that vow. So let's see if we can unpack that. Why do we get judgment and evil? Well, remember what those 3 pilgrimage flocks represented, the 3 flocks by the well. And if Jacob has promised to come back and to tithe the 10th of those flocks, then we see an interesting parallel, because vows were paid at the 3 pilgrimage feasts. You didn't necessarily make a special trip. Just like with Paul, he comes into Jerusalem at Shavuot, and there are believers there who are going to pay vows at Shavuot. So it wasn't coincidence. It wasn't random. It's what's usual. You pay those vows. Once you complete a vow, you pay it at the next pilgrimage feast. Now, you could go earlier if you just wanted to get it out of the way, but once the feast pass, then the next feast pass, then you fall into a very dangerous, you're in a precarious position because you delayed to pay the vow. And so by bringing the 10th of the flocks back to tithe at Beit El, to the place, to the site of the future temple, then what you see is that he delays to bring the flocks, i.e. the people, to the feasts. So ultimately, the sages say, he was afraid that Esau would bring harm to Dinah, but it was his own lack of attention to the feasts. Why do we say feast? Because remember what they prophesied of: Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, the 3 foot festivals. When he delays to bring them to those feasts, that lack of attention to the detail, to pay the vow, is what put Dinah in jeopardy with him. He brought himself into jeopardy, and his children are part of his household. And our children can suffer for our inattention because they don't always have the sense to know how to conduct themselves. That's why they're children and we're grown-ups. And so we don't expect our children to understand the harm of being out with their friends all night, unsupervised. Our children don't always understand the danger of going to so-and-so's party, unsupervised. Our kids don't understand why you have a problem with them going to so-and-so's house, even though their parents are going to be there, but you might know something about their parents that says, there's the danger. It's not in your friend, it's in their parents. Sometimes as parents, you know more than your kids. And because they've never experienced true harm before, when they do come into harm's way, it catches them off guard. And they don't know how to resist. They're just not experienced enough. They're not grown-ups. And so we can see that with this, Jacob had huge blessings, but the more blessings you have, the harder it is to keep track of them. And we might ask for great blessings, but we also have to realize if we can't keep track of them, then they can fall into jeopardy as well, especially if we have placed ourselves in a really bad position by not keeping our word. And so the sages are saying exactly what Yeshua and James, well, his Hebrew word would be Yaakov, his Hebrew name would be Yaakov, but they were both warning their listeners that Jacob's trouble was because he put himself in that jeopardy. It was because of the words, because of the oath, that he put himself in jeopardy. Because he didn't bring the flock to Beit El and pay that vow quickly, he fell into judgment and evil. And that's what he said in Genesis 28:20. It says, Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me on this journey that I take, give me food to eat and garments to wear, and I return to my father's house in safety, then the Lord will be my God. This stone, which I have set up as a pillar, will be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will surely give 1/10 to you. So, okay. Adonai kept his part of the bargain, all the way down to allowing Jacob to cross back into the land in safety. He cleared the way with Esau. And so now the door is open for Jacob to lead those flocks, the 10th of the flocks, to tithe them, to sacrifice, and even to return to his father's house. But what we see in the story is it's like he's just circling the airport. He's cleared to land, and for some reason, Jacob just starts circling and decides to buy a field and build a house. And he delays in a place called Shechem. Remember, that's where Dinah's going to be raped. And in next week's Torah portion, that's where Joseph is going to be headed when he's kidnapped and sold. So he's going to have 2 children kidnapped in that area. And I would say, I agree with Yeshua. It sounds like evil and it sounds like judgment. And here's what the sages say concerning this. Whoever delays the fulfillment of his vows causes his record to be examined in heaven. And so that explains why Yeshua and James are seeing the jeopardy of words that we can bring upon ourselves when we don't need to. They're saying, don't swear. Don't put in more details than you have to. You know, Jacob was very clear. If you will do this, this, and this, and then I will do this and this. Well, when you have this two-way agreement, then you're bound. And what we have to remember is there's a heavenly court. And we know that court systems were commanded upon human beings. And it reflects this reality above. But the heavenly court is completely just, completely fair, and completely frightening. Because in the book of Revelation, as you're reading the events that are going on in heaven and what happens on earth, the judgments on earth, is just, like a word being spoken in heaven, and all of a sudden a third of the earth is. And so we may not like legal systems, but establishing legal systems, court systems, police forces, courts of appeal, all these sorts of things, it's a mitzvah, it's a commandment to establish them. And then those systems have an obligation to function in fairness and truth, because they are the earthly representation of divine judgment and authority. And if the earthly systems are tough, they don't scratch the surface of the power of the heavenly court. And so a contractual obligation, it does become binding, whether we're seeing it as something we would transact that could be supervised by an earthly court. Maybe you make a contract with somebody, you each have a lawyer to make sure all the terms are correct. If there's a dispute, you take it to court. If we take it back in time, when the temple was standing, there was a temple system, there was a court system. And you saw that in the book of Acts, or you will see that in the book of Acts when you have time to read it, that they asked Paul, I said, well, you pay the Nazirite vows for these men to have their heads shaved. When he agreed, then they had to go to the temple that week and notify the authorities that they had completed the vow and that they would be paying it and they would be shaving their heads. And so here there's human oversight. And with human oversight, sometimes if you find yourself in a tough spot, then that court system or that temple system, they could identify the hardship and recommend leniency in that case. But it's very dangerous. And see, he gave us these human courts, understanding, really, we probably don't want to stand before God and let him judge us on a vow. We're putting ourselves in a dangerous spot. Because if you take a vow before heaven's court and the angels, like Jacob did at Bethel, then what you have done is you have precluded this buffer zone of a human judge or a temple court or a jury who can judge the individual situation and say, well, there are extenuating circumstances. We can be lenient in this case. We can extend the term. We can reduce the amount. We didn't anticipate that these bad things would happen and the person would be unable to complete the vow. But see what Jacob did. He added no, he didn't leave himself an escape clause. He went directly to the heavenly court. And so that's why I wanted to look at Yeshua's context in the Beatitudes so that you can see maybe why he's saying it's dangerous, it's evil to not enter into a vow properly. In fact, it's better not to. It's better if you're going to make a legal agreement, his advice is yes, yes, or no, no. And we'll put that in context here in a sec. So I took the English from this Hebrew Matthew Shem Tov. It's from chapter 5, verses 33 through 37. You know the chapter, it's the Beatitudes. And I want to show you, I want to help you to make a little adjustment in your English text. And it's going to make a whole lot more sense in context. And there's even parts of the English translation of the Shem Tov, which George Howard, I believe, did the translation, where I think he's off. I'm sure his Hebrew is much better than mine. But one thing translators have is bias. And I don't know what kind of oversight. I don't know who he had coming after him to help him with that translation. But here's what we have in English from the Shem Tov. Yeshua says, again, you have heard what it was said to those of long ago. You shall not swear by my name falsely, but you shall return to the Lord your oath. But I say to you, not to swear in vain in any matter, neither by heaven, because it is the throne of God, nor by earth, because it is the footstool of his feet, nor by Jerusalem, because it is the city of God, not by your head, for you were not able to make one hair white or black. But let your words be yes, yes, or no, no. Everything in addition to this is evil. And I put the Hebrew text down there of that last verse where he says, let your words be yes, yes, or no, no. And you can see there, it comes out, Ava, Yihiyu, Devarim, Ken Ken, Vegam Lo Lo, Kol Hanosef Azeh Hu Ra. And Ra is evil. So he's saying, Ken Ken Lo Lo. What does that mean? It's legal. When you see the doubled word, it becomes a legal term. It becomes a legal agreement. And so this is what Yeshua is saying. Simplify your words. Avoid taking elaborate oaths. Because the more elaborate the oath, the more, maybe elaborate's not the word, the more expansive the oath, the more likely life is going to be to come in there and impede you in some way from fulfilling that vow. And so his choice of words here is almost like he's commenting on this particular Torah portion, what the sages say about this Torah portion, that this was the beginning of Jacob's trouble when he comes into the land, is not paying the vow immediately. without delay, because he had sworn that oath pretty much by heaven, by the throne, by earth as the footstool. He was there at the Evan Shtia, by Jerusalem, the city of God, because that's where he had laid his head that night. He says, no, just let it be yes, yes, or no, no. So the context, if we go back up here, we can see the context of it is taking the name of the Lord in vain. And in the Jewish understanding of that commandment, what it means is to take a false oath. In other words, for us to give false testimony in a legal manner. And so if we invoke the sacred name of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, as we give testimony, and that testimony is false, then we have taken his name in vain. It's a very legal construct in Jewish tradition. And Yeshua reflects this. He's not saying we should never testify in court under oath, because the commandment clearly is that we should testify to the truth. But what's causing confusion, I think, in the English texts is the translation of the conjunction but. It says, but I say unto you. As you read through the Beatitudes, it keeps saying, but I say unto you, but I say unto you. And the problem is, that's not what it says. And when you use but instead of and, which is what makes more contextual sense and more literal sense, because it's vav. The Hebrew letter that's being used, that's translated as but, is vav. Vav, in its most basic sense, means and. So in most of these cases, and I'm going to show you where there's the exception, where it does say but, where it does use the word aval. Aval is but. In the Beatitudes, where he's saying, but I say unto you, he's saying, and I say unto you. He's verifying that this is what the commandment is, and he's saying, and he's adding clarification. Now, the vav can in some cases mean but. In most cases, it means and. That's why you've got so many Torah portions that start with vav, because the sentences start with and. And so what Yeshua is saying repeatedly in the Beatitudes is, and I say unto you, and I say unto you, Ve'ani omer lechem. And he's adding clarification. So if we go even farther back in the text, we can see more of the context. Verses 17 and 18 are where Yeshua assures the disciples, he says, I didn't come to annul the Torah. I came to fulfill it. And I know we've all looked that up in the Greek because we've had arguments with our friends about what it meant for Yeshua to fulfill the Torah. Well, in the Hebrew, what he said was lehishalem, to fulfill, to repay, to bring to fulfillment. And so his statements are clarifications. They are not annulments in the context. He's not annulling any commandment. He's clarifying by saying and. In fact, the Hebrew in that context, he says, not a jot or a tittle will pass away. Well, that's the English translation is dot and tittle, but it's a really strange oblique reference to something that only occurs in this Torah portion. Yeshua says, when he says that, he says, lo od achat v'nekuda achat. He says, not one ot, not one letter, or one nekuda. Some of you, if you studied Hebrew, you know the word nikud. And those are the little marks that we see on the Hebrew letters. It looks like little dots. So that we call that the nikud. And so in this particular Torah portion, Vayishlakh, Esau's kiss to Jacob has the strangest nikud markings in the entire Tanakh. And I did a screenshot for you, so you could see it in English and then compare it in Hebrew. And then I put a red arrow over the top of it so you could see this strange nikud that doesn't appear anywhere else in the Torah or even in the scriptures. And what you see is basically 6 dots over the word for where nishkot is kisses. And this is going to be a verb construct where Esau and Jacob are kissing. So it's going to be Vayishlakh, Vayishlakh, and they kissed, or Esau kissed Jacob. And you've got these 6 weird nikud, and the sages can't even agree on why that's there. Some of the sages says what that does is it removes emphasis from the text. In other words, Esau kissed him, but he didn't really mean it. And then other sages say, oh no, it emphasizes he really did mean it. They don't know. But remember that root, nikud, or the root of nikud is going to be nakad. Nakad. And so in the context, Yeshua is saying, even things like this, where you've got dots that don't seem to go, there's no explanation for them. He says, even things like this are part of some fulfillment plan, whether we understand them right now or not. So these but statements, they can be misleading when we read them in English. What we can do, though, is we can go back to the Hebrew. And it's going to lend us some understanding and helping us to understand primarily that Yeshua was not changing the ancient words. He was making and statements, not but statements. There's only a couple of cases in that entire passage, in that chapter, where you're going to read the Hebrew word aval, which means but, in those Beatitudes. And one of those is verse 37. So let's go back to that and see what's going on in the text. And if we can understand what Yeshua is saying, then maybe we can understand Jacob's vow. So in verse 33, it says, again, you have heard what it was said to those of long ago. You shall not swear by my name falsely, but you shall return to the Lord your oath. And I say to you, not to swear in vain in any matter, neither by heaven, because it is the throne of God, nor by your head, for you are not able to make one hair white or black. Now we get the but, we get the aval. But let your words be yes, yes, or no, no. Everything in addition to this is evil. So we'll try to, the alarm went off. Great. I'll try to hurry and maybe I can finish with tomorrow's class before we start on Song of Songs. So what Yeshua is referring to here is Exodus 27. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. What he's saying here is don't swear falsely in a human court. Don't invoke the name and then give false testimony. And then Yeshua comes in and he uses this and statement to clarify it and extend it to an oath taken before the heavenly court. Like Jacob, he didn't go to a human court and make his vow. He stood there and the transaction was with the heavenly court. And so it's literally in heaven, b'shamayim is what the Hebrew says. He says, and I say to you not to swear in vain in any matter, neither by heaven, b'shamayim, in the heaven, because it is the throne of God, nor by your head, for you are not able to make one hair white or black. So there's two levels. You shouldn't swear falsely in a human court. And you definitely don't want to stand before the heavenly court as your own representative and begin to make vows, because they are judged much more harshly because of the power that is inherent in that name. We don't know what we're playing with. And that's why it's better to limit our words rather than bargaining. Be careful what you bargain for. If you decide to bypass a human court and go straight to heaven, be very, very careful every word that comes out of your mouth. Because Yeshua is warning his disciples that taking an oath independently of oversight is dangerous. Because you're making an appearance before a heavenly throne and a heavenly court. So what he's saying is, if it's important not to testify falsely before a human court and judge, then how much more should you not presumptuously swear falsely before the heavenly court? And this, I believe, is why he's saying the delays become dangerous. Because at least with an earthly court, there can be leniencies. The court has within its discretion to be lenient, to extend deadlines, to reduce fines, all these sorts of things. They can operate and understand, I meant it when I said it, but this and this and this happened. And so at this point, even Yeshua is saying it's dangerous to vow to a heavenly court, because the slow payer of the oath causes, as the sages say, the records will be pulled up and examined. And who can stand in that sort of judgment? You will be judged very strictly. And it may be that certain protections you were enjoying just aren't there anymore. And that's what, Jacob pointed out, how every time Lavan tried to do evil to him, that it was because of his relationship with Adonai that he came out on top. But all of a sudden, he feels like, my goodness, where did my protection go? And it's like it dawns on him, I have to go pay these vows. But he had already set some things in motion. And so you can see this double principle, like when you see, this is why Yeshua is saying, let it be yes, yes, or no, no, because that makes it a legal agreement. And when you're chosen for a task, sometimes it'll be through the double, like Abraham, and then he's told to go and sacrifice his son. There's going to be an agreement between the two of them to consecrate Isaac. And it even says Abraham believed he could raise him from the dead, if that was necessary. But it was a two-part agreement. Same thing, Moses turns aside, makes this agreement at the burning bush. He's going to bring the flock of Israel back to the burning bush to receive the Torah. And so typically the response when you get that summons is Hineni, or here I am. I'm available for the execution of this agreement. Because what you have to know is, if Adonai invites you into the agreement, it's safe to say, here I am. When we go and initiate the agreement, It may not be safe because we don't know everything he knows. And we can be presumptuous about the future. He already knows the future. And so if you're invited, you're pretty safe saying, here I am. It doesn't mean you won't be afraid. It doesn't mean you won't be distressed. Moses got afraid. Jacob got afraid. There's times when we are going to be afraid. But if we go back and we examine, this is the beauty of Yom Kippur, is we have the annulment of vows. Well, you know what? You don't have to wait for Yom Kippur to annul vows. If you know you've misspoken and you have agreed to something presumptuously, you have said you would do something, you've made a promise that you cannot execute in a timely manner, then you need to go to the person, if it's a person, and you need to seek forgiveness and leniency. Throw yourself on the mercy of that court or that judge. If you've made some vow before heaven, it's much more dangerous. But on Yom Kippur, the understanding is we can't ask for an annulment of vows for things we've done foolishly or said foolishly. Don't wait. If you recognize an unfulfilled promise that had a timeline or that had some way of completion, you need to go back and repent. Like I said, you return that oath. And the process, which maybe, I know it's getting late. Yeah, maybe we should just wrap this up right here. But if you want to see an example of this double principle in a legal transaction, you can go to Jeremiah 32, 1 through 16. And you remember when Jeremiah is going to buy the property, you know, he knows Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, but to demonstrate his faith, he purchases the field. And then they write out the legal agreement, and then they make an extra copy. In other words, they doubled the text. So they had 2 copies of the deed, of the bill of sale, and then it was sealed with a signet ring as part of that legal process. And so when you're entering into a legal agreement, the idea is it's doubled. You might see that double text, like Moses, Moses. You might see a double deed, 1 copy for you, 1 copy for me, or the legal record to be sealed up and then opened if necessary at a future date. And Yeshua is using that. Understanding that when you see that yes, yes, no, no, it's indicating to you that you have made a statement that you believe to be factual. You don't add anything to it. It's just simple, yes, this is what it is, or no, it wasn't this way. But don't add more things. Because you'll get into trouble. The more you talk, typically, the more you're going to get into trouble. And that's what Yeshua is warning us. Let your words be few when it comes to legal agreements. So let me see. Let me stop this recording. We'll just, what I'll do is tomorrow, before we start with Song of Songs, I'll finish that. There's more to come after that because I wanted to show you how the 3 flocks that Jacob bred from Laban's stock, they were each identified as a specific kind, like in Hebrew, streaked, speckled, and spotted. Well, you start digging into that and you realize it has very specific, each one has a very specific relationship to one of the pilgrimage feasts, which reinforces our premise that those flocks do represent the flocks of men, of people, that the house of Jacob is to bring to the feasts. And that's why I wanted you to remember Nikud with those weird dots, because one of the descriptions of the flocks was Nakad, the dotted, the spotted goats. And they have a specific context. So we'll do that tomorrow. I know it's late here